This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elyse.
Hi, Kourtney.
How are you today?
I'm doing okay. It is very warm in Sacramento, and my AC is out, so I'm very warm.
That would bring me a lot of discomfort. I don't thrive in the heat.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm happy to be here discussing the stuff to chew on for our new play.
Yes. And before we get started, what is a stuff to chew on, in case this is somebody's first stuff to chew on?
Yes, that's a great question. So a stuff to chew on episode is those little details about the play that you might learn if you are studying this play in an English classroom, whether it be high school or college. So it's facts about the production history, some high-level information about the context that Shakespeare was writing this play within, as well as themes and motifs. So if you're going to study the play, if you are going to go see the play and you want to know a little bit here or there, that's what the stuff to chew on is. Last week, we did our synopsis episode, which is the moment-by-moment breakdown of the play start to finish. And then after that synopsis and this stuff to chew on in our next episode, that's when we're going to start diving into those lenses and get a little bit deeper into scholarship and kind of the niche areas that you can really get into in these plays, especially the Tempest.
Yes.
There is a lot in this play.
Yeah.
But it's going to be kind of high level for today, just stuff that you can chew on before we dive in deep.
Exactly. But before that, we do have a couple small housekeeping things. First things first, we have a new Patreon patron that we have to say thanks, and ever thanks to, and that is April. So thank you, April, for your support of the podcast. Our paid Patreon patrons provide monthly support as an independent podcast, and our Patreon patrons really help sustain the work that we do.
Yes. Now we want to get into a campaign that we at Shakespeare Anyone launched late last month. And that is our Hot Shakespeare Summer campaign. Now, Elyse, what is Hot Shakespeare Summer?
Great question. Hot Shakespeare Summer is our effort on social media to promote going and seeing summer Shakespeare. There is a great tradition of performing Shakespeare in the summer, especially outdoors. So this is sort of a great time to go see some Shakespeare. And that's what Hot Shakespeare Summer is all about. So if you are on Instagram and you would like to share your Hot Shakespeare Summer, all you have to do is use hashtag Hot Shakespeare Summer and tag us at Shakespeare Anyone Pod, and we will share your Hot Shakespeare Summer stories to our stories. And participants in Hot Shakespeare Summer are going to get the chance to win some Shakespeare Anyone merch now through the end of August. We've recently had some Hot Shakespeare Summer adventures. Mm-hmm. We were able to meet up in person, which is rare for us.
Yes.
We were invited to speak in front of a college group that is going to be performing Twelfth Night and share more information on Twelfth Night and Shakespeare with them. And we have encouraged that group to share their production as part of their Hot Shakespeare Summer.
We also have reflections on a kickoff to Hot Shakespeare Summer that Elyse and I took. I went to the Folger Shakespeare Library. Elyse went to New York and saw Shakespeare adjacent tourism. And we have posted about that on our Patreon. So if you also want to learn about what we've done there, go to patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone. Okay, so that's housekeeping.
Yes.
Whew.
Whew. Now let's dive into our stuff to chew on The Tempest. First things first, let's dive into a little bit of context about the world that Shakespeare was writing The Tempest in.
Yes, I think that's a great idea. This play, The Tempest, is one of Shakespeare's later plays. It's said to have been written in 1610, 1611. It was first performed in 1611. And really, the headlines of Shakespeare's world at that time influenced early modern people during the time that Shakespeare was writing The Tempest. First, navigation and proto-colonialism is a major piece of context that we should know going into this play. What I mean by that is that in the summer of 1609, an English ship was wrecked in the uninhabited Bermuda Islands, and there were several narratives of that accident, and those narratives reached London in the later months of 1610. And so Shakespeare probably wrote The Tempest between the arrival of those accounts and the play's first recorded performance about a year later. And I think it's important to note this because there are some scholars and people generally who like to say that Shakespeare's play is not about colonialism, but there's evidence that suggests that Shakespeare was really influenced by what England was doing at this time.
Right. And England had been interested in navigation and the early ideas of an English empire for years at this point. Even though this is one of his later plays, and so we're in the era of James, the ideas start with Elizabeth.
Yes, and some writing that scholars believe influenced Shakespeare's writing of The Tempest include William Strachey's A True Repertory of the Wreck and Redemption of Sir Thomas Gates, Knight, which is an eyewitness report of that real-life shipwreck from 1609. And there was another survivor, Sylvester Jourdain, who published his account around the same time. So this was in the mind of the public. This very well could have been something that Shakespeare was reading. At least he knew the stories. And one of the big pieces of context for The Tempest very likely was navigation, this shipwreck, and travel narratives that people were talking about at that time.
Another sort of series of current events that were happening in Shakespeare's life around the time that he was writing The Tempest were these domestic politics via marriage, featuring the marriages of both of King James's children, Prince Henry and Princess Elizabeth. While Shakespeare would have been writing The Tempest, negotiations were underway for their marriages. So the political problems of royal marriages and dynastic arrangements would have been on the public's mind during this time period and sort of the headline news of the day. So King James hoped to establish his reputation as a peacekeeper by balancing a Catholic marriage for Henry with a Protestant alliance for his daughter Elizabeth. In late October 1612, Prince Henry suddenly took ill and died, much like how Alonso believed his son Ferdinand dies in The Tempest. Elizabeth was then married off to become the Queen of Bohemia and moved to Palatinate, which is a region of Germany, much like Claribel, Alonso's daughter, in The Tempest. So the anxieties that Alonso expresses over the loss of his daughter and his presumed loss of his son are perhaps influenced by the real-life events of King James and his son and daughter.
And then there are some other contextual influences that would have influenced Shakespeare's writing of this play. One of them would be magic. There was a lot of writing about magical practices during the time period. We talked a bit about this during our Macbeth series. In this case, the magician is Prospero, a man, and so he's more of a learned magical person, and he is not feared or condemned necessarily in the way that the witches from Macbeth would have been. But either way, magic and the writings about magic influenced this play. And then also court masks. Court masks were a part of royal entertainment where actors and members of the court would put on performances, very elaborate, extravagant performances that involved costumes and masks and dancing and music. And they're just very large numbers, very large pieces of court entertainment. And court mask is seen in this play through the court mask that Prospero summons for Ferdinand and Miranda. after they become betrothed. And that's that court masque with the goddesses blessing Ferdinand and Miranda's marriage.
So that was the context. Now let's talk a little bit more about these first productions of The Tempest. The Tempest was first performed November 1st, 1611, for King James at Whitehall on Hallowmas Night. It had another court performance 2 years later as one of a number of plays laid on as part of the festivities marking the marriage of the Princess Elizabeth to Frederick, the Elector Palatine of Bohemia. The Tempest was almost surely written originally for performance at one of the King's Company's playhouses, probably the indoor Blackfriars Theatre, although it could have easily been mounted at the open-air Globe. And The Tempest appears to have been very popular within Shakespeare's time.
Yes, it does appear that way, and that makes a lot of sense because this play contains a lot of spectacle. There are spirits, nymphs, and reapers, hunting dogs, there's a disappearing banquet, there's that wedding mask, that court mask, there's a lot of music, and then there's also like the dramatized Tempest that we see in Act 1. So it might have been a huge, elaborate performance, and in this case, it does make sense that the play could have originally been written for the Blackfriars, that indoor theater, because there would have been opportunities to really play with music and sound because it's a closed space. And scholars think that an organ could have added the island's eerie music.
Ooh.
Ooh is right.
And at Blackfriars, there's the possibility, because it's lit by candlelight, we have like the sea nymph costume that Ariel wears for some sort of like sparkle in the costumes or in props to exist because it's playing with the candlelight instead of the open air.
Mm-hmm. Even though The Tempest was supposed to be very popular, it actually wasn't published until the first folio of 1623. So there are no quarto editions. We would not have this play if it were not for Shakespeare's friends, Hemmings and Condell.
Mm-hmm.
And The Tempest is generally acknowledged to be the cleanest of Shakespeare's early printed texts within the folio. And one little factoid is that the compositors took special care to the first page. It is the first comedy that is in the first folio, and it was the first play that the compositors were working on. And for some reason, they just really took special care with this page, so it looks cleanest compared to other plays and other pages, which might have some more accidents or mistakes on them.
Yes, the manuscript that is used by modern editors and compositors has been identified as one of 6 prepared in the early 1620s by Ralph Crane, specifically for the folio project. So Crane probably copied directly from Shakespeare's rough draft or a copy of it rather than a prompt copy when compositing the first folio.
That's so cool. Yeah, the only version we have.
That's how clean it is it's probably a copy of what Shakespeare wrote. Speaking of the first folio, the editors of the first folio, which is most likely Ralph Crane, did a lot of the organizing of the folio, grouped this play with Shakespeare's comedies, and it is still widely considered to be a comedy. Some scholars do separate out the comedies into a couple of subgenres, problem plays and romances, and those scholars do consider this to be a romance because it follows 2 lovers and ends in a marriage betrothal.
Yes, that is true.
However,
there are a lot of really dark themes in this play. And so, in my opinion, I am like, it's hard for me to grasp onto this play as still being a comedy or a romantic comedy just because of all the darkness that exists between Prospero's magic and the enslavement and these, treason and all these power dynamics. So, in a lot of ways, we've talked about this before. Sometimes, like, the genres don't necessarily mean a whole lot.
Yeah.
But, technically this is
it's
comedy, a romantic comedy.
It's a play where there is comedy, but is it purely a comedy? Definitely not. All right, and I've got one more fun fact. Except for the Comedy of Errors, The Tempest is Shakespeare's shortest play, and it roughly conforms to the unities of time, place, and action. The plot consumes the hours between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., and aside from the storm scene, everything takes place on the island. So, there's a world where you could do a 4-hour site-specific Tempest and try to do it in real time between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m.
And I think Shakespeare was thinking about these things in some of the lines that he writes for some of the characters, reminding of the length of things. There's a little bit of
how much time they have left to do things.
Exactly.
When things are supposed to be taking. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the production history from around Shakespeare's time. But this play has quite an afterlife as well. The playwriting duo of Dryden and Davenant in 1667 write a new version in blank verse and add a subtitle, quote, "or the Enchanted Island," unquote. And then another playmaker, Thomas Shadwell, adapts that play for an opera in 1674. So the Dryden-Davenant version is an adaptation that is for Restoration Theatre. For the next century and a half, these rewritings were performed frequently and dominated stagings and popular conceptions. As we've talked about previously, the Restoration era did not love Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a little bit old and tired. At least this story remains popular in new adaptations of it.
And then in 1757, actor-manager David Garrick presented a restored, though heavily cut, Shakespearean The Tempest that was performed from time to time for the rest of the century. But again, it wasn't super popular to be performed at this time period.
As we move into the Romantic period, the literary period, not the genre, Romantic poets did use The Tempest and Shakespeare as inspiration. They associated this play and Shakespeare with the creative imagination, genius, and poetry, and were really big fans of Shakespeare's work during the Romantic period, which is roughly around 1798 and then lasts until 1837. So shortly after Garrick's rewrite, it starts to inspire other writers.
And The Tempest also inspires Darwinian philosophers and playwrights and authors who, after Darwin's scientific discoveries of evolution, they drew on Caliban, Prospero, and Ariel, those dynamics, to write about and explore humankind's relationship to God. It is notable that during this time period, Miranda is often left out, and we do see that as a theme that Miranda is generally left out up until sometime in the 20th century. So there's a lot of interest in how elements of this play can relate to humankind, but not the entire play.
Speaking of the 20th century, up until the eve of the 20th century, The Tempest was interpreted, it was seen only as tangentially connected to Europe's colonial ventures. But as the 20th century dawned, colonial narratives started to be explored by scholars, historians, artists, activists, and political figures. So, for example, Nicaraguan journalist Ruben Dario wrote a short essay on the triumph of Caliban that berated what many Latin Americans considered the United States' blatant aggression in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Then Uruguayan writer Jose Enrique Rodos' short book, simply entitled Ariel in 1900, contrasted Latin American civilizations with Anglo-American civilization. And Sidney Lee wrote in several essays on American Indians that The Tempest reflected England's early colonial experience and the play's characters to epitomize colonization's representative participants. And Lee wrote with quote-unquote pity for the natives, but from a patronizing perspective, viewing Prospero as civilizing the savages.
Yeah, that one's not so good.
Yeah.
And beginning in the 1950s and 60s, Latin American appropriators of The Tempest recast Caliban as the emblem of South and Central American peoples and substituted Prospero as the imperialist, arrogant United States. So, for example, in Cuba, during the Cuban Revolution, writer Roberto Fernandez Retamar's essay Caliban wrote, this is in response to Rodo's Ariel. Retamar wrote that, quote, "Our symbol is not Ariel, as Rodo thought, but Caliban. This is something that we, the mestizo inhabitants of these same isles where Caliban lived, see with particular clarity. Prospero invaded the islands, killed our ancestors, enslaved Caliban, and taught him his language to make him understood. What else can Caliban do but use the same language? Today he has no other. To curse him, to wish that the Red Plague would fall on him. I know no other metaphor more expressive of our cultural situation, of our reality. What is our history? What is our culture, if not the history and culture of Caliban?" Unquote. So, quite different than Lee's Prospero worship. Additionally, George Lamming of Barbados had already published a quasi-autobiographical novel, The Pleasures of Exile, in 1960, that drew abundantly on The Tempest's plot and characters. And also, Edward Camus Braithwaite, also of Barbados, titled one poem Caliban, another Letter Sycorax, an epistle to his own mother, thereby identifying himself with Caliban. And lastly, Aimé Césaire of Martinique recast the play into his own Un Tempête, with Caliban an African field hand and Ariel a mulatto house servant. So from these few examples of many, there's a lot of claiming Caliban, reimagining the dynamics of the island to utilize for their own liberation.
And then also in the 20th century, we start to see feminist readings of The Tempest, which find in Miranda a model for experiences as Anglophone women and a figure trapped by the patriarchal structure. Sycorax, Claribel, and feminized Ariel and Caliban have been explored through this lens. In Indigo, by the British writer Marina Warner, Shakespeare's sprite Ariel is an Arawak Indian who sleeps with the invading white enemy, Warner's Prospero figure, and bears his child. Ariel becomes complicit with the colonizer when she rescues Everard from the black slave Caliban's armed rebellion.
The last bit of afterlife we're going to briefly mention is that, of course, Freud's theories about the subconscious mind also seeped into 20th century culture and reshaped interpretations of Shakespeare's characters. So Ariel and Caliban came to be seen as embodiments of Prospero's subconscious mind. So now that we've done a lot of context, performance history, and the afterlife, let's talk about themes.
So the first theme is the illusion of justice. The Tempest tells a fairly straightforward story that involves an unjust act, which happens before the action of the play, the usurpation of Prospero's throne by his brother, and Prospero's quest to reestablish justice by restoring himself to power. However, the idea of justice that the play works towards seems highly subjective, since this idea represents the view of one character who has an immense amount of power over the others and controls the fate of all of the other characters. The play also offers no notion of higher order or justice to supersede Prospero's interpretation of events, so the play is morally ambiguous. Who is actually in the right and who is actually in the wrong is debatable.
So the next theme is the difficulty of distinguishing men from monsters. And what comes to mind immediately is Caliban. On the one hand, Prospero and Miranda think that their education of Caliban has lifted him from his formerly brutish status. But on the other hand, they seem to see him as inherently brutish regardless. His devilish nature can never be overcome by nurture, according to Prospero. And it's interesting, this men versus monsters, because Caliban eloquently defends himself against Prospero in many of those confrontations between the two characters. But also, Trinculo's speech upon first seeing Caliban blurs the distinction between men and monsters. So there's this, much like the moral ambiguity, there's this kind of uncertainty about men versus monsters that we get from Trinculo's speech.
There's also the allure of ruling a colony. The nearly uninhabited island presents the sense of infinite possibility to almost everyone who lands there. Prospero found it and thought it was an ideal place to school his daughter. Sycorax, Caliban's mother, worked her magic there when she was exiled from Algeria. Caliban laments that he could have been his own king if Prospero hadn't landed here. And in his attempts to comfort Alonso, Gonzalo imagines a utopian society on the island over which he would rule. So all these characters envision the island as a space of freedom and unrealized potential. However, the tone of the play toward the hopes of these would-be colonizers is vexed at best, as they seek to rule the island while seeming not to rule it, completely missing the Commonwealth.
Next is Prospero's threats. Prospero issues many threats in The Tempest, demonstrating his innate violence and cruelty. For the most part, Prospero directs his threats at his servants. Prospero's threats typically contain elements of magic, as when he reprimands Caliban for his disobedience. Prospero also makes harsh threats against his more helpful servant, Ariel. Even though Prospero promised to liberate Ariel after a period of faithful service, when Ariel reminds his master of this promise, Prospero warns Ariel that he will imprison Ariel back in the tree if it's mentioned again.
Speaking of Prospero's threats, there's also a coordinating theme of obedience and disobedience, which underscore the island's hierarchy of power. Prospero stands at the very top of this pyramid of power as both the former Duke of Milan and a gifted student of magic. He is the most powerful figure on the island, so he therefore demands obedience from all of his subjects, from his servants to his daughter. And at some point, however, each one of these subjects disobeys him. Caliban specifically swears his allegiance to Stefano, trading one master for another in an attempt to topple the island's hierarchy altogether. Miranda challenges her father, and Ariel also continually reminds Prospero of promises Prospero has made to Ariel. These complexities ultimately suggest that the island's hierarchy of power is less stable than it appears. Within this, there's also the dichotomy of the good servant versus the bad servant. Prospero plays Ariel and Caliban off of each other, treating one as a good, obedient servant who he threatens but does not actually punish because Ariel does good behavior for him. But then he actively punishes Caliban because Caliban rebels against him.
And there's also a theme in this play of treason. So Shakespeare weaves the theme of treason throughout The Tempest. The first instance of treason occurred in the play's prehistory, when Antonio conspired with King Alonso to assassinate Prospero and succeed him as the new Duke of Milan. The attempt to kill Prospero was both political treason and brotherly betrayal. And the theme of treason returns in the form of twin assassination plots that arise during the play. While Caliban and Stefano plot to kill Prospero and take control of the island, Antonio and Sebastian plot to kill Alonso and take control of Naples. Both of these plots get interrupted, so despite these men's treasonous intentions, they ultimately do no real harm.
On a slightly different note, for a second, the themes of wonder and admiration also are woven throughout this play, and they center on Miranda, whose name literally means both wonderful and admirable in Latin. In a play so full of negative feelings about past wrongdoings, Miranda's optimism about the future serves as a beacon of hope. She most clearly symbolizes optimism about the possibility of new beginnings and a better future, what she herself calls a, quote, brave new world, unquote. However, in spite of Miranda's optimism, wonder also sometimes carries a less positive connotation in The Tempest, and a slightly threatening undertone, as under Prospero's command and Ariel's magic, the island is itself a place of wonderful occurrences that are meant to confuse and disorient. In this sense, the wonders of the island conceal truth for the purpose of manipulation.
And the last theme in The Tempest is monstrosity, which we've talked a little bit about earlier, but the theme of monstrosity constitutes the flip side to the themes of wonder and admiration. Whereas wonder and admiration apply mainly to the beautiful and loving Miranda, monstrosity applies mainly to the ugly and hateful Caliban. The word monster appears most frequently in the scenes with Stefano and Trinculo. Upon first laying eyes on Caliban, Trinculo identifies him as a fishy-looking freak, and he imagines exploiting Caliban's monstrous appearance for profit on the streets of a city. Caliban's monstrosity derives not from his appearance alone, but from the contrast between his savage appearance and his civilized language. Although Caliban stands as the primary example of monstrosity in The Tempest, Alonso also uses the word monstrous to refer to illusory sounds and visions produced by Ariel.
And that's it for the themes. Now there's a couple more motifs really quickly that appear throughout the play. First up, masters and servants. Nearly every scene in the play either explicitly or implicitly portrays a relationship between a figure that possesses power and a figure that is subject to that power. The play explores the master-servant dynamic most harshly in cases in which the harmony of the relationship is threatened or disrupted, as by the rebellion of a servant or the ineptitude of a master. So we see these pairings in Prospero and Caliban, Prospero and Ariel, but also Alonso and his noblemen, and Stefano, Trinculo, and Caliban.
Another motif is water and drowning, and occasionally the references to water are used to compare characters. For example, the echo of Alonso's desire to drown himself in Prospero's promise to drown his books calls attention to the similarity of the sacrifices each man must make. But perhaps the most important overall effect of this water motif is to heighten the symbolic importance of the Tempest itself. It is as though the water from that storm runs through the language and action of the entire play, just as the Tempest itself literally and crucially affects the lives and actions of all the characters.
And then one final motif is the mysterious noises and music of the island. The island is indeed, as Caliban says, quote, full of noises, unquote. And the play begins with a tempestuous noise of thunder and lightning, and the splitting of the ship is signaled in part by a confused noise within. Much of the noise of the play is musical, and much of the music is Ariel's. Ferdinand is led to Miranda by Ariel's music. Ariel's music also wakes Gonzalo just as Antonio and Sebastian are about to kill Alonso in Act 2, Scene 1. Moreover, the magical banquet is laid out to the tune of, quote, solemn and strange music, unquote, and Juno and Ceres sing in the wedding mask. The noises, sounds, and music of the play are made most significant by Caliban's speech about the noises of the island in Act 3, Scene 2. Shakespeare shows Caliban in the thrall of magic, which the theater audience also experiences as the illusion of thunder, rain, invisibility. The action of The Tempest is very simple. What gives the play most of its hypnotic, magical atmosphere is the series of dreamlike events it stages, such as the Tempest, the magical banquet, and the wedding mask. Accompanied by music, these present a feast for the eye and ear, and convince us of the magical glory of Prospero's enchanted isle. And, as we mentioned earlier, it was most likely performed in an indoor theater, which allowed for all of this music and special effects to be easily heard and experienced by the audience. And that's our stuff to chew on for The Tempest. I cannot wait to dive into more.
It is going to be such a wonder and a brave new world.
Come along, you fishy-looking freaks.
That's right.
Is that what you said? You said like fishy-looking freaks.
Yeah, fishy-looking freak.
Thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From Othello, Act 2, Scene 3, said by Montano. Come, come, you're drunk.